Good morning, everyone.
Good morning,
Good morning, Rabbi.
We're learning Mishnah Yishkalim, Parak Zayin, Chapter 7, Mishnah Zayin, Mishnah 7. So the previous Mishnah was discussing the enactments of the basin of the heart. There were 7 enactments that were mentioned, and we are now up to the last couple of enactments. All these enactments had connections to some, to issues that were connected to the sacrifices in the Beis Hamikdash. So Mishnah 7 reads like this: Mishnah Zayin, Ala Melach v'ala Eitzim. Also in regarding the salt and the wood, that the Kohanim should be able to benefit from them. Now the rule is that all offerings or parts of offering, anything that's burnt, any animal part that's burnt on the altar on the Mizbeach, has to be salted before it's placed on the fire. That's what Torah says. It has to be salted. Now, that salt was designated for sacrifices. Now, the question is, you have a Kohen. He has a sacrifice that he's going to be eating the meat from it, and he needs some salt for his meat. Can he use that salt? Now, even though the sacrifice that he's eating, it's sacrificial meat, it's holy, but it's not on the same level of sanctity as something that's burnt on the altar. It's not the same level. What's burnt on the altar is considered on a higher level of sanctity. So it comes out that the salt was designated for something of a higher level of sanctity, and now he wants to use it for something lower. So the sages, the Beis Din, the High Court instituted that you're allowed to use it, even though you're going down a notch, going down a level. And they bring down here in the notes, the court is able to do this by stipulating that the initial consecration of these items allows for such usage. Meaning, when you first take the salt, right, you have to consecrate it for the purpose of using it for the sacrifices. So what was instituted by the Beis Din, by the High Court, is that when these things are consecrated, that they are consecrated, cleared to be used for the sacrificial parts on the altar, but they can also be used for when the Kohanim need to do the mitzvah of eating the meat. Now, the same thing applies to the wood that's mentioned. The wood was the wood that was designated to be used for the fire on the altar. That's a holier purpose than using the wood to cook meat, to cook up the meat that you want to eat. Yes, it may be sacrificial meat, but you want to cook it up. So what do you cook it up with? You need wood to cook it up. To use the wood that was designated for the altar would have been taking it down a notch to use it for meat that's being eaten, even though it's a mitzvah. But here too, the Beis Din, the High Court instituted that they would be able to use it for that. Now, it's interesting also to note is, and this is something new to me. I knew that when we were learning Pesachim, and we learned about the Korban Pesach, we learned that a person would bring what's called the Korban Chagiga together with the Korban Pesach. Why? Because since the Korban Pesach is meant to be eaten in a way that it fills you up, when you eat it, you then become full. So sometimes the meat of the animal that you brought is not enough for that. Got a lot of people there. So you bring an extra sacrifice it's a sacrifice, it's a shlomim, and you eat it, which is what a shlomim is done. That's going to kind of now fill you up in a way so that when you eat the Korban Pesach, it'll make you satisfied. Well, it seems the same thing was done for all sacrifices. Same thing. It seems like any sacrifice, a big Korban Pesach, probably that was more of an obligation. But for other sacrifices, it seems also that along with the sacrifice, they would eat meat. It wasn't a sacrifice. They'd eat meat. They brought in the animal. They shechted it. It was all tar. It was all good. It was okay to be there in the Beis Hamikdash. But it was there for the purposes of making it that when you eat the carbon, that the carbon will then be eaten in a way that it fills you up. For that meat, you can't use the salt. You use the salt on the actual sacrifice meat, but for the regular meat that you're bringing for the purposes of eating the carbon in a certain way to fill you up, that you can't use the meat or the wood for. So that's the first. Yeah. For that, you have to say that's what the Mishnah means when it says Ala Melach v'ala Eitzim. They instituted regarding the salt and the wood, that the Kohanim would be able to have benefit from them. Now, next, V'ala Para. They now also instituted regarding the Para Aduma, the red cow, like the red cow that has to be completely burned, turned into ash. Its ash is mixed with spring water and used for purifying and it's sprinkled on a person to purify them from their tuma, they're becoming impure from a dead body. So the Mishnah reads about hapara. They instituted regarding the para duma, that there would be no me'ila regarding its ash. Now, me'ila is where if you unintentionally benefit from something that's been sanctified to the Beis Hamikdash, and you benefited from it unintentionally, so you've got to bring a carbon, a sacrifice to atone for that. You also have to pay for your benefit plus a fifth. Now, there are certain things that have sanctity to them that me'ila doesn't apply to. So, for instance, the para duma is ashes. Okay, a para duma in many ways is treated like a sacrifice, but it's not really a sacrifice. It was burnt actually outside of the Beis Hamikdash. So now you've got this ashes. Are you allowed to use those ashes for your own benefit? You don't want to use it, ash to go ahead and heal a wound? No, you can't do that. But if you were to do it, again, unintentionally, there would be no liability. There would be none of the laws unique to Me'ila would apply there, because the laws of Me'ila don't apply there. You cannot full benefit from it. But to say that if I do, I have to bring a sacrifice, I have to bring an Asham Me'ilas, a guilt offerings for being moyal, plus the other things, would you have to do that? No, you wouldn't have to do that.
Does that only
1 second. Me'ila only applies for shogeg in general. At least regarding bringing the sacrifice and the added fifth, that fine. Okay, now, so a para aduma really, essentially, even according to Torah law, there's no me'ila that applies to it. The problem is that although it's forbidden to do, when you don't have a consequence to what you do wrong, then people will do it. People were using the ashes of the para aduma to treat wounds. Apparently it worked, or they thought it worked. They use it for treat wounds. Are you allowed to do that? No, but there's no consequence to it. So people were doing it. So therefore, the sages instituted, no, we're making rabbinic me'ila. We're going to say if you use the ash of the para aduma, you got to treat it like something sanctified that the laws of me'ila apply to. Well, the problem with that was that when they started, because of that institution, people were not using the para aduma ashes even when they should, because they were afraid, it's gonna seem like, it's gonna look like, or I may come to benefit somehow, and I'm gonna have to pay for it. So they started backing off from the para aduma ashes in general, which was a problem. Yeah. So the Chachamim that instituted, we're going back to the original. We're going back to the original law. We're going back to the Torah law. But there is no me'ila, even from the rabbis, for benefiting from the ashes of the para aduma. Next, va'alakinim hapasulais. And for bird offerings that were found invalid, shubais mishal tzibor, that they should come from the community. That means like this. We remember if we're talking about the chests that they put, one of the chests was called kinim, for bird offering obligations. Now, what the people were given the opportunity, as we mentioned, that if you had to bring a person, let's say had an obligation to bring bird offerings, he became a zav, let's say. When a person's a zav and they want to become completely pure, they have a whole process they have to go through. Part of the process is to bring two bird offerings. Now, a person needed to do that, didn't have to go ahead and bring two birds and give the birds to the Kohanim, but rather he could put it, there was a chest for it. They put money in the chest, the amount of money that was needed to buy the birds. The Kohanim would come to the chest, take out the money, buy the birds, and offer it for whoever gave it. My understanding is it wasn't left in a packet with a name. They put the money in. I don't think so. I don't remember seeing anything like that. No, they just put the money in and they took the money, and whoever it was for, it was for. That was it. The money was there. The money covered the cost of the birds. And whoever gave that money, they brought the money as a bird offering for them. Now, what happens if, somebody takes their money, they put it into the chest, they walk away, right? I'm leaving now. I leave it all to the Kohanim to take care of. The Kohanim buy birds from the dealer that they get their birds from. And then they find it, and then they find the birds being invalid. Something invalidated. It couldn't be brought for a carbon. Mm-hmm. It had some kind of a blemish. It had some kind of internal wound. that they could see even before you slaughter it. Okay, that means that the birds that they bought were no good. So what happens to the guy who put the money in? He needs another set of birds, but he's not around. He's not around. I guess this was essentially a chance you took. If you're going to take this, if you're going to go ahead and you're going to put the birds here and you're going to walk away, you're taking your chances. That's my understanding. But at the end of the day, the sages instituted that if this is what happens, that a person left their money there and the birds are found invalid, that we will cover the cost for your birds. That those birds will now come from communal funds. The communal funds will cover those birds. Now, when you go ahead and you take the communal funds and you buy those birds, you have to buy those birds for the person
From the dealer.
For the dealer. You have to buy those birds. You have to buy those birds for that person.
Specifically.
I mean, you may even not know who the person was. But the point is, that person who put the money in, who we used his money to buy birds, and the birds came out being invalid, that now when we use the communal funds to buy birds, they're for him. That's the first opinion. Say it's instituted that where does the money come from? It comes from the communal funds. Rabbi Yossi says, Hamasabek hasakinim, the one who supplies the birds, Masabek hasapsulais, has to supply or cover the ones that became invalid. Now we learned a couple of weeks ago the following: that the Gizbarim, those in charge of the treasurers, let's call them, of the Beis Hamikdash, they would go to a supplier, and they would buy from the supplier oil, wine, wood that they would need. Right? They made up a price. They bought it in bulk, and this is what they bought. Now, what happens? So they go ahead, they go to the supplier, they give the money, the supplier gives them the supplies. And let's say we're talking about wood. And then it comes out that after they took the wood gets wormy. And you can't use it for the altar. Whose loss is it? You remember?
Yeah,
No. The supplier. The supplier has to cover it. The supplier has to cover it. Even though he got the money, the sale was made. He can use the money. However, or if the price fluctuates, the same thing.
Mm-hmm.
The law, Yad Hekdesh Alayena. Hekdesh always has the upper hand. Always has the upper hand. That was also a law instituted by the sages. Rabbi Yossi says not only is the sour wine or the sour oil or the wormy wood or the fluctuation of price covered by the suppliers, this case is also covered by the suppliers. In this case, that was dealing with a person, a private person. He put his money, right? And then we took his money to buy, and the birds came out being no good. This is what happened. They became invalid, right? And so we're not dealing with, the direct communal funds of the we're not talking about the funds of the Beis Hamikdash. We're talking about a person who gave money to cover his obligations. Nonetheless, according to Rabbi Yossi, the supplier has to cover that too. That was also instituted by the Beis Din. The supplier has to cover that. That in case, again, the supplier gives the birds, if it comes out at the end, those birds that were meant to cover a private person, but they came out no good, the supplier has to cover it. That's also included in what the sages instituted. So that is Rabbi Yossi's opinion. And the Bartunera says the halacha is like Rabbi Yossi, that it's the supplier has to cover it.
So the supplier does not have an incentive.
Well, it was an incentive maybe because it was you can make a big sale. You took your chances, but you made a big sale. Have a wonderful day.
Thank you, Rabbi.
If they